I feel really little compared to the other presenters. And kind of biological, you know? And yeah, there's actually a quotation that Dorothy says at one point, after he says, "I'm the great and powerful," she says, "I am Dorothy, the small and meek." That's my role here. I want to say thank you to Pak So-jung and for hosting this and bringing us together. I have to say, this group is about my favorite one to get together with. There's absolutely no pressure. It's just a really great exchange, and I'm very happy too that some University of Wisconsin educated people like Baek-Young-sun and Tobias have joined us. And I had to change with Brooks Zaporin, and I want to thank him too for that. Not because I really wanted to present at past midnight my body time after being jet lagged, when I could have I was scheduled to present at a perfectly reasonable hour, but not for that, but rather because, as it turns out, Chris Fraser and I had very similar approaches to this conference, and it gave me a few hours to radically alter my presentation, which has a large chunk taken out now. But we'll see if I can say enough thank yous that I can use 90 minutes as a whole. So why am I talking about the Syncretist or HuangLao chapters of the Zhuangzi? Well, it's the simple reason is, this is a little close here, okay. The reason is that we were fishing around for, well, what should we do for this conference? And I think I suggested the Tian chapters, and then it was translated by So-jung into the HuangLao chapters. And here I'm not attributing that she's saying they're HuangLao. It's probably a Suo-wei HuangLao chapters, right? It's one of those things that's just one of the ways that people talk about this because of this stratification project. And I thought, well, you know, I've done close readings for the first two versions of this. Why don't I try something a little different? And the reason I did is because in 1994, I wrote a dissertation on HuangLao Taoism in the aftermath of the Huangdi Sijing. And so my dissertation was on that topic. And I thought, well, okay, why not do reading Zhuangzi closely, but instead kind of addressing this idea that it's a HuangLao chapter, because I feel like, you know, having spent kind of time fairly recently in my career turning to Zhuangzi, I was kind of in a position, a fairly unique position to put this together. So today I want to kind of narrate an asynchronous meeting between sinologists, philosophers, and historians gathering to discuss a literary text like the Zhuangzi as my topic for this synchronous meeting. And the meeting happens around this project of stratifying the Zhuangzi, and specifically designating a subset of the outer chapters as materialist or syncretist or HuangLao. So HuangLao is a Western Han phenomenon that's been largely explored by historians and scholars who work on excavated texts in the wake of the discovery of the Huangdi Sijing. Really was in 1973 at Maungdui, is one of the really catalyzing events in the popularity of this phrase. There were essays by people like Guo Moreau on HuangLao, but really the attention to it really only started in the 80s in the wake of some influential articles. And it's interesting, the historians who look at this generally don't use the Zhuangzi as part of their data set. So even though people like Graham or Liu Xiaogan say these are the HuangLao chapters. Generally speaking, they're not. I looked at about 10 different books on HuangLao, well, maybe 5 in Chinese before coming here, but I looked at some before too. But they don't have sections. They'll have sections on Huainanzi. Sometimes they go even all the way up to the Taiping Jing, but this isn't a part of the dedicated study. So then, for scholars who approach Zhuangzi as religious or philosophical thought, questions about stratification are sometimes bracketed, or the inner chapters are taken as a standard by which the rest of the text is deemed worthy or unworthy of consideration. Now, sinologists, along with some intrepid historians of philosophy, are more concerned with text formation and are more apt to consider the text as a whole without an assumption of internal consistency. They're the ones who seem more interested in the stratification project. So I want to narrate this discussion between these different groups, and then at the end point out some merits and demerits of the process. So the historical discussion of issues of authorship and layering of the Zhuangzi text goes back at least as far back as Guo Xiang's comments justifying his editing the 52-chapter version of the text preserved by Lu Deming in the Tang, and this is something that that Chris mentioned before, and well, no, I don't want it to do that. I was looking for a laser there. Oh well. So this is part of Lu Deming's preface to the Zhuangzi Yi. Guo Zishan, the Guo Xiang, said, those encumbered by a narrow vision, and that's a chu, not a shan with 2 peaks, made rash alterations and strange arguments, like the pieces, right? So this is what he was saying, the show, right, of blocking the game token and intent on salary. That's actually Richard Lind's translation, intent on salary. I had no idea what to do with that particular one, Yixiu. And the chapters Dangerous Words, Swimming Ducks, and Zishu. In each case, these were skillfully mixed in, and in total came to about 30% of the text. Okay? So when he says 30% of the text, it seems to indicate that he's reducing it by 30% by taking these parts out. Is he talking about in terms of the total word count, or it's roughly 30% of the chapters going down from 52 to 33 too? The Zhuangzi 52 pian listed in the Hanshu bibliographic treatise was commented on. So this must be the now ending Guo Xiang's quotation. The Zhuangzi 52 pian listed in the Hanshu bibliographic treatise was commented on by Sima Biao and Mr. Meng. Many of its words are fantastic. Some, like the classics of Mountain and Seas, some are of a kind with books on dream divination. So commenters abridged that edition based on their own senses of it. Interestingly, in the Kozanji Guoxiang postface, this is also attributed to Guoxiang. And that's kind of strange because we've already broken the quotation, and that attributes this to Guoxiang. It could be that Lu Deming is simply paraphrasing Guoxiang without directly attributing it. But it is kind of interesting, and that's what made me decide to quote the Tang kind of discussion of quotation of Guoxiang rather than the so-called kind of direct postface of Guoxiang, because there's something a little kind of confusing about the relationship between the two. In any case, and that's really interesting, right? So this is what was taken out by Guoxiang. All experts agree on the inner chapters, but some additionally only have outer chapters without miscellaneous ones. Only the material that was the trend commented on captures master Zhuangzi, and so So his is the one that is universally prized throughout the world.
See, the people on Zoom didn't have to deal with this, and now I got feedback. Wow. See, this is why. Is this on or off? Looks off. I don't know why I'm echoing. Can we go back to this? Okay. I just turned it on.
Can you see?
I just don't want to be in front of the thing for the people. I guess they're here, right? So I mean, you can see it on either side too. So I'll just stick close to the close to the mic. So in this description, Lu's willingness to jettison certain generic mismatches is superimposed on Guoxiang's rejection of rash and strange interpolations in the service of recovering the original aims of Master Zhuang. There's already an idea that it's a somewhat composite text. Lu claims that Guo excised the inconsistent language and that the inner chapters was distinguished not by the fact that it was written by a person rather than his school, as later generations would understand, but rather by the fact that commentators agreed on their internal consistency, and then agreed on which ones the inner chapters were. So questions of authorship and authenticity in the 33-chapter version were raised in the Song, notably in Su Shi's rejection of the 4 miscellaneous chapters, 26 through 29, Rangwang, Daozhi, Shuojian, and Yufu. But it wasn't until the late Qing that the idea of a distinct early imperial stratum characterized by different language and concerns became widely accepted. Works like Yao Nai's Zhuangzi Zhangyi and Zhang Shibao's Nanhua Waizha Pian Bianwei and Wu Rulun's Jiankan Zhuangzi Duban all isolated out a set of chapters that had early imperial vocabulary and syntax, although they were somewhat different in what they chose to focus on. Primary among these chapters are a set of outer chapters 11 through 16, Zaiyou, Tiandi, Tiandao, Tianyun, Keyi, and Shanxing. It was during this period that the view that the last 6 of the outer chapters and the first of the miscellaneous chapters, that is 17 through 23, were each a development of one of the inner chapters. And so these different kind of ways of relating the different parts of the text to each other, really, that was when it was, a lot of this was done on the basis of, largely on the basis of vocabulary, which was thought to be kind of imperial period. What I found, though, when I was looking at Liu Xiaogan is that what I was surprised at was the degree to which he really relies upon Guanfeng's set of strata. So Guanfeng is the most, let's see, I think I have a picture of Guanfeng in the next one. Yeah, there it is. He's the most influential, I think, 20th century developer of a comprehensive set of strata in the text. And he lived from 1919 to 2005, and he's a really interesting figure. I mean, I had heard his name quite a bit. Graham talks about him, Liu Xiaogan talks about him quite a bit. But I didn't realize that he was from Shandong. He was a scholar, but more than that, he was an influential Chinese Communist Party official and ideological gatekeeper. So he started in the propaganda bureau of the party in Shandong, and then eventually rose to become the head of the philosophy research group of the Politburo in Beijing, eventually having a brief appointment at Renda and CAS, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, before then in the first year of the Cultural Revolution, he spent time on a lot of the high committees of the Cultural Revolution, but then spent the next 15 years in jail when his fortunes turned a short while into the Cultural Revolution. So he also published, I mean, his influential early work is really what we see Graham and Liu picking up on. But it's later in the 90s, he kind of revisited some of these. And it's kind of interesting. There's a book called kind of 10 experts on the Zhuangzi that goes through 10 names. I think Chen Guiying and Guanfeng are towards the end of the people they consider. And so there's an essay in Guanfeng, and it said, well, later in life, he changed his views on things. And I thought, well, maybe the kind of Marxist framework that he's using and that I'm going to be describing here is something that he might have repudiated after the Cultural Revolution. But as it turns out, no, he just kind of tinkered a little bit. He still was very interested. His primary concern was still identifying Zhuangzi's class identity. But it was just that he had slightly different views on some of the specifics. So in the 60s, early 60s, he published a text called Zhuangzi Weizha Pian Chutan. And that was part of a work on the inner chapters. And he divided the outer and miscellaneous sections of the Zhuangzi into several subsections. And so building on the work of Luo Gunzi, who had just died, actually, by then. He was part of the Gushibian project. Guan argued that none of the sections of these chapters were the work of a person named Zhuangzi, but rather reflected, in part, the works of groups like the leftist Laozi followers, or Laozi Hoshui Zuo Pai. So that's chapters 8 through 11, which is really a nomenclature that's modeled on the kind of young Hegelians, so that it's consciously kind of mimicking that. Or the followers of Songbing and Inwen, that's chapters 12 through 14, the ones we're looking at, or the followers of Yangzhu, chapters 26 through 27, 27, and 29. So actually, the groupings are very similar to the ones that we've been talking about, Graham and Liu today. As we shall see, Guan's project is very idiosyncratic, but his map of the Zhuangzi was followed closely by scholars like Liu Xiaogan and Angus Graham. So to talk specifically about his readings of chapters 12 through 14 in particular, this grouping was mostly adapted by later stratification schemes. Guanfeng cited what was at that time recent work by Guo Moreau and Liu Jie that connected the 4 Guanzi chapters, right? These are the ones that Hal Roth is always talking about. And with the traditions of Song Xing and Inwen. So these two thinkers are grouped in the Tianxia of the Zhuangzi, where they're associated with, among other things, a kind of pacifism on the outside that reflects a certain restriction of desires on the inside. And Harold Roth calls them the inner cultivation tradition that's preserved in texts such as Guanzi's Neye, inward training, and Xinshu, techniques of the mind, that Roth also says is the basis of the Keyi, chapter 15 of the Zhuangzi, and the Jingshan Xun, chapter 7 of the Huainanzi. So Guanfeng develops the connections between these chapters in the Zhuangzi and the Guanzi chapters over 4 sections. So he believes these are produced by the same group of people. And these are the 4 kind of similarities that he sees, that he draws out. So the first is that there's a connection between Dao and Tiandi, and that Tian, so that's the title of the section, but in this section he points out that Tian actually takes precedence over Dao. 2, the connection between the ways of the ruler and the ministers. 3 is entitled Concerning Views About Benevolence and Righteousness. rites and music, the rule of law, and forms and names. So and I'll go through each of these. And 4, being empty and quiescent, techniques of the mind, and purifying the mind. So he claims these instances of shared or similar goals and concerns indicate a strong affiliation between the content of the 2 sets of chapters in the Zhuangzi and the Zhuangzi. Sorry. So Guan uses each of these 4 criteria to contrast against the Laozi and the rest of the Zhuangzi outside of these 3 chapters. So he posits that there's a Lao Zhuang view, which is the inner chapters of Zhuangzi and the Laozi, but that these chapters are fundamentally different. For the first criterion, Guan argues that in the rest of the work, outside these chapters, Tao is above Tian and Di or produces them. However, in the chapters that he's talking about, both Tian and Di have their own Tao, and Tao is often secondary to them, as in the Tian Tao chapter. This first quotation. So this is, for this reason, the ancients who clearly understand the great course, this is a poor-end translation. You can tell by great course. Although I saw one of the other translations someone was using translated Shun as course, and I was thinking that's confusing. So great course first got clear about heaven, Shen Ming Tian, and next went on to the course and its intrinsic powers, right? So this is interesting because this quotation doesn't, and I'll be curious when people start talking about Tian Dao, this is not necessarily talking about some kind of ontological primacy. It's talking perhaps about some other, arguably is not quite saying what he says it says, but he has about a dozen quotations, and it is, I don't know, I found this the most convincing of his criterion. So just to be clear, talking about the 3 Tian chapters, 12 through 14, he believes a related set of Han writers produced chapters 15 and 16, and he talks about kind of the differences between those 2. And he also notes the last part of chapter 11, which promotes an inactive ruler with active ministers, should be part of the 12 through 14 unit. So the 3 chapters, 12 to 14, form a narrow group, but he also sees them as the core of a kind of 5.5 chapter unit, which also is very much like what Liu Shaogan writes, or the way he divides things up. So in addition, Yao and Shun let the natural way of Tian and Di take its course, and Guan notes the following story praises those sage kings in a way that's not found in the inner chapters, right? So that's the second quotation. So these are just 2 I selected out. I want to focus a little bit on Tian Dao. Most of the quotations I have are from that chapter. So it was heaven and earth that the ancients considered really great. That is what the Emperor Yao and Shun shared in admiring. So again, kind of, but not quite the exact claim he's making. But so he ties this claim that Tao is not put first, but rather Tian or Tian Di, into a Marxist evolutionary account of the development of the history of ideologies. And I'll talk more about this in a little while. But while putting Tao first as idealism, he says that the Song Yin kind of approach reverses this and puts the naturalistic Tian first, right? So, and these chapters are materialist rather than idealist for this reason, right? So, and of course, from Guan's perspective, this is the one text for early China that displays a mature materialist point of view for that reason. And I did a chapter for a volume that Liu Shaogan did on the Laozi that really looked at kind of the 20th century reception history. And it's really interesting the degree to which this materialist idealist kind of framework that's derived from kind of the kind of Marxist understanding of the development of the European history of ideas, how much that is part of the reception of the Lao Tzu too, that there was really a kind of one-size-fits-all way of talking about kind of early texts. Guan makes the claim that the Songyin chapters alone promote the idea also that the ruler acts through Wu Wei, but the ministers act in a Yo Wei manner. Again, the most explicit example that he cites is from the Tiandao chapter that contains the clearest illustration of this claim. So this is that kind of complicated passage. But when those above are non-doing and those below are non-doing as well, those below exert the same intrinsic powers as those above. If those below exert the intrinsic powers of those above, they cannot be their subjects. So this is case one. And if those below engage in doing, but those above also engage in doing, those above share in the same course as those below, and if they're not sharing in the same course as those below, they cannot be their lords. So that's case two. So it doesn't work if they're both non-doing, and it doesn't work if they're both doing. So those above must be non-doing, served by what the world offers, while those below must engage in doing, being of service to the world. This is their unchanging course, right? Technically, I suppose the ruler could be doing and the ministers could be non-doing, right? That's the fourth alternative that's not really mentioned. But I don't know, there's only one ruler and there are a lot of ministers. It'd be a very busy ruler, I think. In any case, but you see, this is a very good illustration of this. While Guan admits that the other two chapters contain nothing as explicit as this passage in Tiandao, he does cite the last passages from Tiandi and Zaiyou as having a similar theme, which he also says animates the Lu Shi Chunqiu and the Han Feizi. This passage he cites from but the problem here with his thesis, now remember he's arguing that both the Zhuangzi four chapters and the Zhuangzi chapters have the same philosophical orientation. But the only chapter he cites from the Zhuangzi focuses on the Wu Wei nature of the ruler, but doesn't mention minister. Or no, he cites several passages, and they're all about the Wu Wei nature of the ruler, right? So it doesn't really fit in terms of the Guanzi chapters in this case. So all in all, this criterion is somewhat unconvincing for his overall thesis. And Guan admits, actually, at the end, he says, well, this is kind of pangjang, it's kind of circumstantial evidence. So the third argument is that these chapters of the Zhuangzi have praise of a variety of administrative approaches that are not praised elsewhere in the text. So a passage in Tianyun about the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, for example, argues methods of governance need to adapt to the times. And this is the top one. So similarly, the rituals and principles and standards and measures used by the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, and again, I'm using Zaporin's translations for these, are not esteemed because they were all the same, but because of the good governance they produced in each case. They are like hawthorns, pears, oranges, and grapefruits. Their flavors are completely different and opposed to each other, but all of them are pleasing to the tongue. A chain argument in the Tiandao chapter combines most of the approaches that Guan mentions. The ancients who clearly understood the great course first got clear about heaven and next went on to the course and its intrinsic powers. Once they were clear on the course and intrinsic powers, they next went on to human kindness and responsible conduct. Once they were clear on human kindness and responsible conduct, they next went on to maintaining allotted role divisions, right? Yeah, so this is a different kind of fun, I think, than in the one we were talking about earlier today, which, yeah, it's kind of like the share that things get. Anyway, when those were clear, they moved on to the relation of objects and to to their names or actual performance to prescribed tasks, is how Zipporah does it. And this actually goes on, and there are a number of, it actually matches really well with this passage in Qian Xia that is talking about kind of the different steps or kind of the when you apply different techniques of administration. And the length of this argument, this chain argument, is also really interesting. So this passage goes on to talk about moving on to reward and punishment, for example, and the synthetic nature of the rulership in these Zhuangzi chapters, as with the 6 kinds of expert in Shiji 130, is convincing. So I also think that he's found an interesting aspect of this chapter that arguably is different from much of the rest of the Zhuangzi, or at least isn't found there in that same way. Of course, I mean, everything isn't found in anyway. However, while the Guanzi chapters also talk about ritual and music and their value in inner cultivation, the single reference to reward and punishment from Neya that he cites is underwhelming. So there's a passage that says rewards are insufficient to promote good actions. Shangbuzui Chuanshan. And harsh punishments are not enough to deter errors. Xingbu Buzui Chengguo. Again, this connection to Song and Yin then is not particularly convincing. So I think with the second and the third criterion, he really does show that there is some version of this in the Zhuangzi chapters, but he's really kind of forcing it to find it in the Guanzi chapters. In the fourth criterion is the opposite. It's one about which the Guanzi chapters provide rich evidence. This is the one where he's talking about the vocabulary of being empty and quiescent, techniques of the mind, and purifying and whitening the mind, 2 of which are titles of those Guanzi chapters, is so deeply ingrained in those chapters that he argues they have epistemic status in those texts. As with the Laozi, the chapters of the Zhuangzi talk about being empty and quiescent, he notes, although these terms do not have the same status. He makes a big deal in this one of the fact that the term techniques of the mind occurs in the Zhuangzi, but in the 10 chapters, but the context is really different. The context is this kind of Shunzian discussion of the form and function of minor rites. So he's talking about kind of at the very end, he gets to the 5 moi, the kind of, so bun, and then he gets to moi, these kind of, and Zipporah translates as these 5 kind of derivative branches should only be taken up if combined with the circulation of the pure kennel of imponderable spirit within us and the stirrings of the mind's own arts. So, xin shu zhidong. For there were indeed among the ancients who engaged the study of these derivative branches, but they never made them primary, right? So, gu ren youzhi, our face wei xianya, right? So so this is indeed a discussion of xin shu, or it uses the vocabulary of xin shu, but to me, this is finding a mention of that combination of characters being used in a rather different way. It's much more like Shunzi talking about kind of the management of affect through the use of appropriately regulated ritual in the Li Lun chapter, for example, right? So there, good people have a certain, would mourn their parents forever. Bad people would mourn them not at all. I don't know how that happened.
Actually, you didn't click the...
No, it's spooky.
Just because Xin Shu.
Yeah. But a 3-year mourning period is then kind of the method of managing one's mind in that way. So While this hardly counts as a connection between the techniques of the Zhuangzi chapter and the Zhuangzi chapters, other examples show that the mind and quiescence are regular topics in the Tian chapters. But what Guan doesn't claim or doesn't show is that these terms are not common elsewhere in the Zhuangzi, which they certainly are. So taken as a whole then, the criterion that works best is the subordination of Tao to Tian. While most of the criteria apply to the Zhuangzi chapters, the others are either true of one set of chapters but not the other. So Guan's project then is not especially successful on his own terms because he's trying to show sets of chapters in both the Guanzi and Zhuangzi were written by a particular group. And that's a much different project from simply proving filiation. Reading Guan today, it kind of seems to be an unforced error. Why does he insist on pouring old wine into old bottles and identifying his kind of group with the chapters of the Songyin tradition? What's going on there? Well, Guan's project was in part to identify Zhuangzi's class identity and to read the early tradition in light of the victory of dialectical materialism, right? So this 1960, 1961 Zhuangzi Neipian Shijie Pipan first looks at the inner chapters and then has this section on the outer and miscellaneous chapters. And in the first part, he argues Zhuangzi is a tool of the landlord class and that his philosophy was an example of subjective idealism. And this is the same thing that was argued about Lao Tzu. Guan's project was that the rewriting the history of early Chinese philosophy in terms of a Marxian analysis of the development of the European history of philosophy was the primary project. And he actually served as the kind of xiaozhang of a number of schools, and you get the sense that his remaking of the historical curriculum must have been something. In that light, Zhuangzi's relativism and what he calls Aqiuism shows that the Zhuangzi was the product of this declining slave-owning class. And he approvingly cites Lu Xun's reference to Zhuangzi as Confucianism. Well, the Chinese is Hutu Zhuyi, right? And that's like Confucianism. And so really, so to some extent, Lu Xun is not as systematic, but he actually is fairly dismissive of Zhuangzi in some ways. And I think that the general feeling here is that if you think life is but a dream, then it's exceedingly difficult to develop the proper class consciousness you need to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Right? So against that backdrop of arguing that the Zhuangzi reflects this orientation, he isolates these chapters, this Songyin section in the Zhuangzi, as aligned with a particular historical moment when the empire had been established and experiencing a turn to the right in order to cater to the needs of the emperor. However, it's a materialist analysis. And so in that sense, it's kind of the one perspective that is kind of breaking free from the idealism of the past. And actually, the next two chapters, 15 and 16, are even a bit better because he argues they don't cater to the needs of the emperor and are preserving their potentially revolutionary character. So for Guan, their privileging of the naturalistic Tian set them apart from the rest of the Zhuangzi. And alongside the Han Feizi, which he said contains the seeds of a materialistic perspective, they are the historical predecessors of the current revolutionary thinking at the time he was writing. So while Guanfeng's view of the text is blurred by his ideological agenda, he was motivated to do a certain type of close reading in terms of a materialist-idealist binary. And doing that reading led him to develop earlier views about the multivocality of the text, because his hermeneutic of suspicion no longer is interested in the author, but rather interested in looking at different sections of the text as produced by the particular historical circumstances that whoever wrote them were. And that's the interesting thing. And in a way, to me, that's why this type of Marxist point of view actually jibes a little bit more with less of an emphasis on the authorship function, right? Because the idea is that, and I had to do this, I remember at Taida, when I was in the IUP program, we had to read this book called 中国文学发大史. And it went through all of Chinese literary history, and every author's output was explained by the historical circumstances of that they were born into. And I thought, this is so different from the kind of romantic notion of literary creation that I was brought up with, right? Where it's the person kind of rebelling against the moment of their times, right? Because so each person is creative in a way that transgresses the norms of their moment, whereas this book explained the creative output of each of the authors in terms of their them simply being an expression of the material kind of circumstances into which they were born. So it's this same kind of contrast between a kind of author as an agent or the kind of circumstances of the time. So he saw these as being, and of course, the early empire, Han Feizi was the model during the Cultural Revolution, and the early empire then is kind of uniting the state in a way that is consistent with the self-image of those around Mao, like Guanfeng. So as a synthesizer of early text critical scholarship, what he does is he takes this observation about when these chapters were written, and he uses it as a basis to characterize the different voices in Chinese history independently of the putative authorship of different texts. And in a way, I think that's where the appeal of his scheme to someone like Graham would have come in. And clearly, Liu Xiaogan and A.C. Graham really are appropriating the Guanfeng scheme fairly directly. Graham's use of the term syncretism in his translation Zhuangzi of the Inner Chapters belies his, albeit selective, acceptance of aspects of Guan's analysis. Graham says that the unified empire required a unified ideology, and for him, this accounted for the impulse to combine different approaches. And he uses the term syncretism, right? So when Csikszentmihalyi develops this term syncretism, he's talking about kind of combining different Christian kind of, so it's a post-Reformation attempt to say, look, all these different, after these wars, all these different versions of Christianity actually have quite a bit in common. And so this is the context of the original use of the term. What Graham is doing is something slightly different, but actually a little comparable in the sense that he's saying after the warring states where you have these divergent philosophies, the empire needs a unified ideology, and so therefore they develop this kind of hybrid system, and that's why he uses kind of syncretism as his description. Also, the materialist-idealist dichotomy is clearly something that is too tied to a particular, much later, much geographically different analysis of the history of philosophy that would not be suitable. But he takes the same chapters, right? So he's much more selective, though, in that he talks about how at the end of chapter 11, or he groups the end of chapter 11, the prose introductions of chapters 12 through 14, the 10 chapters, what he calls the Tao rhapsodies of the chapters 12 and 13, and he adds chapter 15 and chapter 33. And they all belong in this category and share, quote, a coherent and distinctive set of ideas. His description of these ideas are very close to Guan's first and third criteria. Guan writes that Tian is now the superior member of the pair Tiandi, and Dao has become secondary, so that's the first criterion. And he also reflects that the chapter is essentially political and less about self-cultivation, and that a variety of approaches, including Renyi and Fa, are incorporated. So that's kind of the Graham appropriation of it. Liu Xiaogan says that a similar set of chapters incorporate Confucianism and legalism, but instead of Syncretists, he calls them HuangLao. And Liu Xiaogan eschews Graham's selectivity in defining his subset as the second half of Zaiyou, with chapters 12 through 16 and Tianqiao. So basically, he takes Guanfeng's scheme and adds Tianqiao, Guanfeng's broader kind of definition, exactly, and adds the Tianqiao chapter. Following Graham, he writes that these chapters do not discriminate, they assimilate and accommodate several Confucian and legalist points of view and, quote, emphasize the arts of the ruler occupying the throne and expound the principle that the Lord should be inactive while his ministers are active. That being Guanfeng's second and third criteria. Liu also emphasizes the willingness to incorporate a variety of administrative techniques. So while neither Graham or Liu used the evolutionary model of the history of philosophy, they both make gestures to the changes that occur during the imperial period. So they're using the kind of late Qing location of these chapters as early imperial products, and then Guanfeng's idea of what it is about their philosophy that makes them distinctive, and end up describing the Syncretist HuangLao view as a consistent viewpoint that is a response to changes in the early empire. Right? And this raises, so note that we're talking both about a kind of temporal argument and a kind of philosophical argument that are combined in a what seems to me a kind of 中国文学发大史 kind of way. But it also raises the question, well, what defines HuangLao? And is this a reasonable characterization of the features that these scholars of the Zhuangzi have isolated? So there's no contemporaneous evidence for the existence of a self-conscious faction or school in the Western Han that calls itself HuangLao. Okay, so outside of the Shiji, we don't really have, we have Huangdi texts that have been discovered. We have all sorts of Lao Tzu stuff. We have some references to these texts as, you know, being distinct from other bodies of texts. But HuangLao itself is a product of the Shiji. Today, when scholars speak of such a faction or school, they tend to describe it on the basis of either an orientation or a textual corpus that aligns with the Shiji, which is the locus classicus for the phenomenon. So the Shiji isolates HuangLao mottos or HuangLao techniques mentioned in the Shiji. So in the Shiji, there are 16 uses of HuangLao. 9 modify yen and 4 modify shu. So they're either HuangLao theories or words or HuangLao techniques. So 2 nominal uses of the term are for Shunzi's learning. So it's rooted in HuangLao and centered on Xingming, and Han Feizi, who similarly took pleasure in Xingming and Fa Shu learning, and yet could be traced to its roots in HuangLao. So this seems to be so those are the times HuangLao is used as a noun. Their learning, importantly, is explicitly Xingming, but was based on HuangLao, leaving the nature of that term somewhat vague. It may have been textual, technical, or doctrinal. The other nominal use is when Cao Shen commends Gai Gong's recounting of HuangLao, where it says Yan HuangLao. So that well, actually, there was a J in the original publication. So, well, I'll get to that in a sec. So that's kind of where, so a number of figures are defined as being good at HuangLao theories or HuangLao techniques, and in the Shiji, and I'll discuss that in more detail in a minute. But so what individual scholars do then in defining HuangLao is often they will take a set of core HuangLao texts, like saying, what are HuangLao Shu? Well, it must be, say, the Huangdi Sijing, and it must be the Lao Tzu, or they've differently understood what defined a HuangLao tendency. So based on those texts, or based on the Shiji, the people who are described as HuangLao in the Shiji, then what they'll do is they'll generalize a set of beliefs or a certain set of specialized vocabulary that then they look for in the early corpus and and define that as HuangLao. So at times the scholarly consensus on HuangLao becomes evidence in itself, leading to a certain circularity of the definition. So one of the best historians working on the topic that I'm going to talk about further on and rely on is Cao Feng. But if you read his book on early Taoism, at times he'll identify certain texts as HuangLao using locutions like, quote, it is commonly recognized in the academic world as a typical HuangLao text, or, quote, it is commonly accepted in academic circles as rich in HuangLao thought. And then that text then is used, the content of that text is used to define HuangLao. So it's a very kind of circular project at times. When they attempt to be more precise, historians use the term in different ways. One is kind of textually based, isolating out common features of Yellow Emperor and Lao Tzu text. Another is scholastic, based on identifying instances of, say, Taoist legalist synthesis, or a more general syncretist attitude, as in the Shiji Liu Jiazhi Yaozhi, right? So Sima Qian's kind of use of the 5 jia that then, when you consider them as a totality, become the 6th jia, which is Dao Jia. Finally, it's often described as an independent administrative and or philosophical school of thought, or Sixiang, behind policies or texts in the Western Han. So that's kind of the practice in talking about HuangLao. And so I feel that there are some real kind of problems in the fact that, first of all, these three are different, but second of all, the way that a lot of people tend to use the term is as simply as a generic replacement for Lao Zhuang in the early period, or excuse me, in the Western Han period. So in light of the scant evidence for the phenomenon outside of the Shiji, the question becomes one of understanding why Sima Qian introduces it as a descriptor. Once we look more closely at the Shiji itself, the claim that it was a school of thought is I think, somewhat harder to sustain. Cao Feng notes that during the Western Han, the idea of Tiandao was central to a variety of astronomical, administrative, and technical arts texts, and says, HuangLao thought was not a hollow, abstruse philosophy, but rather a practical political theory with specific operable content. And I think that's a really good kind of quotation. And it's really actually very much what the conclusion I came way back in 1994 in my dissertation, that it's associated much more with people who have kind of specific technical or administrative approaches, and that involve kind of these shu, these kind of techniques and calculations, or techniques and algorithms methods. And I tried to develop that in an article in 2003, which Michael Nyland and I wrote about the rhetorical function of HuangLao in the Western Han. So it was really about the schools in the Shiji. But we looked at HuangLao in particular, and I wrote, the Shiji is the first text to employ the HuangLao category. Its retrospective imposition on a handful of figures need not suggest their adherence to a body of internally coherent HuangLao thought, as HuangLao could have served as a rhetorical foil for the contemporary classicists. And so Nyland's argument is that in the Rulin Zhuan, Sima Qian is very critical of the Confucians for pursuing kind of office, studying only to get office. And that for Sima Tan and his son Sima Qian, the HuangLao tradition that they're constructing is a kind of foil to that. So in saying this, I'm not saying that HuangLao is simply a bibliographical category talking about Yellow Emperor and Lao Tzu texts, but rather Sima Qian's use of it as an alterity has a strong rhetorical function in the project of the Shiji. So making the jump to assuming that HuangLao has an independent sociological existence is a very conventional move that a lot of people make, but it is kind of a leap of faith given the lack of evidence of anything of the sort. And I think this becomes even clearer when you look at the kind of lineage, that's kind of at the center. Oh, wrong way. There. So this is the lineage that's supplied by Sima Qian that's perhaps the most tantalizing suggestion for an independent HuangLao transmission. And the passage in question is the end comment to the biography of Yue Yi in the Shiji. And this has a kind of a HuangLao genealogy that goes back into the Warring States period with Yue Chenggong, who studied the Yellow Emperor and Lao Tzu. And his root teacher was named Hushang Jiangren, which I think is kind of interesting given Tobias's kind of Hushanggong reading. But no one knows where he came from. So he's one of these kind of prototypical, mysterious, immortal figures. And you know, his student's name is even more that way. So Hushanggong taught An Qisheng. And An Qisheng, of course, appears in kind of feng shui descriptions of the techniques of immortality. So, and of course, Huangdi himself in the Shiji, what happens to him at the end? Well, the Yellow Emperor, you know, there's this apotheosis scene where he and his entire retinue ascend on the back of a dragon, right? So this immortality technique connection is in some ways not surprising. So it's fairly clear that we've got some kinds of quasi-mythical people within this lineage. So An Qisheng taught Mao Shigong, who taught Yue Shagong, who taught Yue Chenggong, who taught Gogong or Gaigong, who taught in Gaomi Principality and Jiaoxi Commandery in the region of Qi and served as a teacher to Chancellor Cao Shen. So this connection with Qi is very strong in a lot of ways in the Shiji. And these last two names are actually historical figures, and so we move from a kind of quasi-mythical set of figures at the beginning of the lineage to actual historical figures that Sima Tan would have encountered at the end. So the Shiji's construction of a HuangLao textual transmission of the type Sima Qian elsewhere reserves for lineages of interpretation of the classics, I think supports this idea that it is in some ways a rhetorical foil for his portrayal of the thirsty Ru scholars that he disparages elsewhere. The classic in this case is perhaps a transmission of the Lao Tzu that ends with Gaigong or Gogong and Cao Shen, the historical figures who applied a Wu Wei style of office holding to their time in office, especially Cao Shen during the reign of Emperor Wen in the Western Han. And those stories, of course, are well known from the Shiji. Ikeda Tomohisa, the Todai scholar, says that the Shiji contains both a narrower definition of HuangLao, that is defined by the lineage, and a wider one that's applied to pre-Han writers and others who may have been connected to texts connected to the Yellow Emperor and Lao Tzu. strictly speaking, then, this is perhaps the reason for the term HuangLao being employed in the Shiji. So if this is really what kind of technically HuangLao means, it points to problems with the use of HuangLao to kind of, I think, allude to a particular kind of philosophical orientation, whether you're calling it materialist or syncretist or HuangLao, to characterize the content of these chapters. And I want to conclude by a couple of observations that I hope kind of fall out of some of the descriptions I've made. So first, when authors like Liu Xiaogan intend to talk about the precursors of Taoism in the Qin Han period more generally, sometimes they use HuangLao as a shorthand for non-Ru texts. And this creates a kind of vagueness that I don't think is very productive. The problematic issue is that simply dating the text to the Western Han doesn't connect them to either, well, to any of the HuangLao definitions I've talked about. It doesn't necessarily connect them to Yellow Emperor and Laozi texts, or to the lineage outlined by Sima Qian and his slightly broader application used elsewhere. And the authors we've read go between using HuangLao as a temporal marker and as a philosophical descriptor. So Guanfeng, for example, combines his arguments about what the doctrinal elements of these chapters are with dating arguments that could be considered completely independently from his kind of scheme of the development of the history of philosophy, and that are, for the most part, consistent with Qing scholars and Luo Ganzi. So, for example, Guan develops their prior arguments that these chapters were written in the early imperial period, citing use of the word Di, emperor, or Di Wang, in these chapters. And he says these are vocabulary that seem to be kind of distinctive of the Qin or post-Qin periods, or curses of Han period experts in immortality, or the reference to the Sanhuang Wudi, which he says are only found in Qin texts, and the verdict that the Sanhuang Wudi's methods are not applicable because they need to change with the times. He also says it's post-Qin. Now, I don't agree with all of these, but my point is that it's a very distinctive or different type of argument that's temporal rather than talking about the content. And this linguistic temporal argument is fundamentally different from his arguments about historical changes of philosophical development. And while they don't articulate this, Graham and Liu's work preserves this same elision. And I think that's what causes a lot of the confusion. Their work infers the text produced in the first part of the Western Han is syncretistic or HuangLao because they were produced then, right? When in reality, if you look at the Han, it's a multivocal period, just like the Warring States. A second issue is the dependence on the unit of the chapter. So this is where whole pages were excised. So what I tried to do, and the reason I was pecking away at my computer was, instead of reiterating what Chris said, I wanted to kind of develop this in a little bit of a direction to create a conversation. He's sleeping in Toronto. He has no idea I'm talking about him. It's okay. So yet even what somehow, so in light of what we know about text formation, this dependence on the chapter clearly doesn't work, and I think Chris said that very well. But even what some have called the chapter approach, though, is not strictly speaking a chapter approach. So Guan defends the difference between 3-chapter unit, but at times changes his arguments to defend 5.5 chapters, right? He also notes there are passages in all 3 of these chapters, 3 of the Qian chapters, that do not fit with his argument. So he does take out certain pericopes that he feels are more consistent with the inner chapters in all 3 of the chapters. And Graham is even pickier when he isolates individual sections across the set of chapters that are syncretist. In some ways, looking at the Zhuangzi in terms of pericope units is kind of a continuation of this trend of more precise subdivisions. And I want to note that this is not going to be the last word, right, in this, that we can keep going with this trend. And I wanted to think about some of the ways, building on our earlier discussion, that this can happen. And I was thinking, in the Confucian corpus, excavated texts have shown some instances of unmarked layering. So like the Zi chapter that's been found several times, comparing it with the transmitted Zi, we have this idea that there are layers within each zhang of old comments, quotations, right? And some people say, well, this is Kongzi and kind of the Zi comment, and then there's a kind of connection to a particular text at the end, much like you find in Han Shi Wai Zhuan or parts of the HuangLao. So within each zhang, within each pericope, and I'm all for pericopes. If you read my chapter on interlocutor collections and the formation of the Lunyu, it's all about pericope, but even the pericope has to, be seen as potentially a composite, right? Or unmarked explications of circulating oral formulae is also something we see in the Confucian text that could very well be going on in the text we're looking at. And I think Tobias's connection with, the Huainanzi Zhuangzi, this idea of interlinear commentary that you don't really realize is interlinear unless you notice the parallels in the Zhuangzi, is a great example of this too. So pericopes can be bricollages too. And the problem is with our new model that we were talking about earlier is that the editor's work is often not visible in the words of the text, but only in the patterns by which the text is arranged. And for that reason can be much harder to discern. So imagine we're talking about Guoxiang and the way that he's taking things out, right? So imagine if Qiandao, if he took out all the passages, he notices that there are certain passages where Tian is given priority over Dao, and he segregates those. In effect, he says, "Oh, well, this really belongs in the Tiandao section," and Ikeda actually tells us that in the 27 chapter versions that were circulating, like the Sui text, that Tiandao was of these chapters. That was the one that wasn't included in those, right? So then the passages wouldn't show up in the other chapters, but would all be isolated in the Tiandao chapter, creating a type of thing that then we would interpret as stratification when really it's the product of the editor. In terms of the Zhuangzi, another way of complicating this picture is something I thought of when I was reading Cao Feng for this paper, because he points out a feature of Han technical texts that's very suggestive, I think. Cao cites half a dozen excavated and astronomical and received astronomical and technical works that circulated in the Western Han, and shows how each repeatedly inserts two-character phrases introduced by Ming Zhiyue, and it has a two-character phrase. And this is in these very technical texts, but also in some of these kind of what he calls kind of these kind of, he calls them philosophical texts, but they're kind of explorations of how technical texts work. And often the first character will be Tian, and then the second character. So, and these names appear to be almost divinatory in nature in the way they're introduced, but they're probably alluding to terms of art or mimicking that way of alluding to terms of art. We know that formulae such as chapter 29, Ming Zhiyue, or the nest people, or and which is written both with the Ming in the transmitted version and the Ming name in the Zhangjiashan version, or the more celebrated line Cizhiwei Wu Hua, right, in the Qi Wulun, are sprinkled throughout the Zhuangzi. And the question is, well, what if these formulae are indicative of a kind of systematic interpolation from the same period? That, in other words, someone was taking the Zhuangzi and then adding this element to it systematically. And the reason why I introduce this as just a possibility is because when we did this at the University of Chicago, Esther and I did the Tianxiapian, and some of the ideas that came out of that got put into this article that, oh no, wait, I've got to, is that here? No. Right, that I did with Zheng Yifan, and it's about the Tianxiapian and other Western Han taxonomies. And in it, we argue the Tianxia is particularly concerned with integrating technical knowledge into the conception of the Tao of the age, which other voices at the time considered exclusively accessible through the classics. And we look at the Hanshu Yiwenzhi, and we look at the Shiji Liujiazhi Yaozhi, and show, I think, how many parallels there are between these works and the language, especially talking about how, true knowledge has become fragmented as a way of justifying the inclusion of technical arts into the discourse about the Tao. And so at one point, we argued that Tianxia ends with the claim that all branches of knowledge, past and present, derive from a primal unity. The chapter doesn't explicitly recognize the potential to go back and tap into that unity, but its survey of the various methods and techniques in circulation implicitly holds out the hope that in learning these, the unity may be glimpsed. While the unitary way is the original source of all knowledge, the exceptional sages and rulers of the past discovered and developed that knowledge, creating further techniques as they adapted to the challenges of their time. So instead of looking for this kind of as a feature of a particular stratum of the text, this kind of this insertion of this kind of quasi-technical text language, though the idea that this convention of the Han Shushu genre is the product of, say, an editorial hand, we'd want to do the opposite of a stratification project, right? Because we'd want to assume that it would show up equally in all the different strata, despite their differences in approach, because we're looking for an editorial hand rather than an authorial one. And so just to kind of test this, I went through and did this. Wait, I'm going the wrong way again. I tried this. So I looked, and this is since Chris Fraser's talk. I wanted to look at all the 2- and 4-character mottos introduced by Ming or Mingyue, Suzhi Wei, and Weizhi. So these are all over the Zhuangzi, right? And I found a very equal distribution across the text. So if comparing the Napian, the Ypian, and the Zapian. So in the 7 Napian, we find 15 instances, 15 Ypian, there are 27 instances, and 11 Zapian, there are 18 examples. So in each section, then, there's about a 1.5 to 2 of these per chapter. And so just in this kind of fun, but just very impressionistic reverse stratification experiment, it's kind of a provisional success in some ways. So anyway, that would be one way you can talk about both kind of a temporal addition to the Zhuangzi that's not in chapter form, but rather would be kind of interlaced into it. In any case, what I've tried to do is show some problems with the stratification project by kind of giving it some historical contextualization. And I think that if you look at, first of all, the influence of Guanfeng, but also at the intellectual context in which he developed it, of that formative stage of the stratification project, you can see how later versions actually end up smuggling in some of the early presuppositions that Guan makes based on his particular view of history. And so my intention is not to discourage reading the text as not authored. I think for very interesting reasons, Guan develops this system in a way that is actually kind of for somewhat accidentally very, very similar to, or maybe not, maybe there's actually some deep similarities between his view of history and the way that we're looking at these early texts as kind of multivocal composites. And so I don't want to rule that out. Maybe it's not that different, but I also think we want to look at these texts as not authored, given what we know about early text circulation. But I think that if we better understand the way our current models developed, we can get a better view of the ways in which we need to overhaul that particular approach. And to bring these kind of historians of philosophy into conversation with people who study the way that Sima Qian develops this category, HuangLao, I think is one way of showing the problems with calling these HuangLao chapters. And that's all I have. So if we have questions or I want to further discuss this, I think we're going, next couple of days, we're going to kind of the particulars of various chapters. But given that we're kind of calling this the HuangLao chapters, I wanted to have this as a chance to kind of kick some of this around before we do that. So feel free to kick this around.
Thank you so much for meticulous analysis and tracing back to the HuangLao, the lineage of HuangLao. Actually, we don't have much time, but 10 more minutes, but we may have more time, but not very long. So maybe 15 minutes or so. Yeah, any questions? Actually, directly, if you have questions, then you have?
Just for clarification, so I wouldn't call these chapters as HuangLao anymore, so HuangLao chapters, never. So you added this passage in the last PowerPoint. Does this mean this is the editorial voice, or why you?
Well, so I was just experimenting with this idea of because we were talking about editors, and because this is something that's very characteristic of a certain approach to, or a certain genre of writing about technical texts, and that so it is evenly distributed. It's particularly dense in the Tian chapters, and I feel that there's some other arguments that are kind of half-cooked that I have about the connection between Tianxia and the Tian chapters, but I do think that there's that this is I always wondered what all those times they come up with these. You're reading this and you're saying, okay, I can parse this, and then it says this is called frog in a blender, and you're like, okay, where does that come from? Or Tianshu, or things like that. And then when I read this kind of these parallels in other texts, it's kind of the exact same thing. And I was thinking, well, if we know this was kind of, these original things were redone at at this same time. What if it's, and Chris talks about the inclusion of kind of, what does he call it, rough drafts at the end of things? Or we get two versions of the Pung Bird story told over again. And you're thinking, well, what exactly is going on here? That inclusion of those mottos seems to me like one of those textual features that I've always scratched my head over. And then I see them in these other texts, and I'm thinking, well, here we might have, a Western Han editor kind of, adding in kind of something, or conceivably, then that becomes a principle for organization of certain chapters, right? That if you want to say they had an even stronger hand in organizing things.
I found Tobias' question. I think, yeah, Tobias, you can ask question.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you, Mark, for the wonderful thing. I've sent you a text about the Guanfeng thing. I think we need something about Guanfeng in our reception history project in the future. One thing I want to just say is, right, I mean, like, you can add to the way and or the wage and so forth, like copulas or like short terms like 事故服故 and so forth. They also, I mean, at least in the Huainanzi, they oftentimes show up right before such textual parallels. So it might be worthwhile, right, to even perhaps increase the vocabulary within the Zhuangzi to ask yourself, do we find there's such text formation elements, right, that could perhaps be editorial comments that are inserted or that are included in the Zhuangzi without ever being marked, because that's what people didn't mark them. But I have a question for you in some sense. So the one thing that I was wondering about is, you're very hesitant in some form. So on one hand, right, you show very nicely how Guanfeng, right, has his Marxist agenda and so forth, and how people are appropriating him, but you never really describe it as some sort of problem or anything like that. But you try to keep it as kind of a historical phenomenon that just happened. And I'm just wondering, whether perhaps you can say a tiny bit more about, like, did you see any kind of underlying pattern in how these models and these historical models oftentimes have been utilized in such a way that they closed off the Zhuangzi in many ways, right, or limited it or cut it down, and how basically what kind of solution we have in order to avoid, to perpetuate and repeat those kind of attitudes towards these texts when we deal with them.
So do you mean how Guanfeng effectively closed off?
Yeah, so I think, like, what happens, right? It's like when you think about Graham, Liu Xiaogan, and Guanfeng, I mean, if I would say it, I would say they basically provide an interpretation but make a historical claim that what they just tried to make to create coherence within the Zhuangzi, they claim that this is Han Dynasty, right? So for me, they make their argument bigger than what they actually can do with it. Right, and so for me comes out of this a kind of a question is how, and I think Chris was pushing in the direction, right, when he said we should talk about discourse. What kind of options do we have to avoid making the same kind of exclusionary mistake, right, in some form that some of the earlier generation has done, that put a text like the Zhuangzi in straitjackets because there was this claim that it's a historical argument rather than an interpretive hermeneutic argument that is put forth.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that that the way Chris is doing it is the way someone in the philosophy department who takes text formation seriously has to do it, right? And I think the alternative is the people who will say, we have to bracket all these historical considerations, and we'll just use the principle of charity to smooth over these edges, these rough edges, where the Zhuangzi appears to contradict himself. And it's really, in a way, it reminds me of the way that kind of insider and outsider people approach canon, like insiders will just, everything is about kind of reading the text as an internally consistent and coherent document. And so I remember I gave a presentation at Princeton about the multivocality of the Zhuangzi, and I was taking this stratification very seriously. And my argument was, is that in a text that's multivocal, you can make it say anything by quoting selectively, right? So you can cherry pick this section and say the Zhuangzi is X, and you can cherry pick that section and say the Zhuangzi is Y. And so all I was trying to do is make a claim that really, when you're talking about a text that's composite like this and has diverse points of view, you need to approach it in a slightly different way. You have to have a different set of kind of evidentiary standard. And there was a philosopher in the audience who published an article in Tao basically misconstruing my point completely, but saying, oh, these historians want you to think that the Zhuangzi is multivocal and things like that, but we philosophers know that the constructive use of a text like this, you just have to apply the principle of charity, and then it'll be, consistent. And so I was real kind of, first of all, it was the first time I'd been really kind of attacked in that way, about this kind of way of doing it. But I do think that that's kind of one of the issues, is that if you are taking a kind of, text critical approach, whether it's to the Bible or it's to a text like the Zhuangzi, you want to be clear that you're not questioning the importance or the validity or the social role of the social importance of the text, because people will take you to be saying that in a way, and as you say, closing off the text, right? And in fact, when I've talked about this with respect to the Analects too, there have been people who have accused me of trying to silence, and there actually was someone in France who wrote a piece about how questioning the kind of, when the Analects was written, and he attacked Mick Hunter and Martin Kern and me, was a typical American attack on the historicity of the Chinese tradition, right? To me, what I'm doing is saying, no, the Analects isn't, it's a relatively late stage. Let's look at its relationship to what came before, because it's all very important, right? And actually, if we want to know the history correctly, we want to get the chronology right. So it is, but I think that kind of shows what's at stake in terms of potentially blocking the discussion of it off. And so it is an important question.
So it's a moral question, right?
Well,
What we're dealing with.
it's a moral question. Yeah, I mean, in as much as research priorities are kind of a moral question, right? Period. I don't know that it's necessarily more moral than others. I don't know. Okay, worth thinking about.
Thanks.
Although we don't have much time, actually time's up, but still, I would like to collect some questions from the floor.
This is closely connected to that, so maybe it will be more of a comment, but I agree with your critique of relying on the pericopes, right? And even when you made the comparison of the bricks and the mortar, I thought, but the problem is the bricks are being changed too, right?
Yeah.
But the problem, at least when you're pushing about these interpolations and across the text, seems like there's no way to start construing meaning in terms of anyone's intention, right? So at least with Chris's version, you have like the author of the pericope, and you can say this is what it means. But once you start to say, well, no, but maybe this sentence and the next sentence were written by different people, you really have no way, it seems like, to get a meaning that's based on something like historical accuracy, even, right? And then that seems to push back toward even toward a postmodern view, but the philosopher's view then, well, then why not read it as a whole? I mean, why not? I mean, you're basically like making stuff up no matter what, if you're going to get any meaning out of it. So then I don't know, it seems like the project almost undoes itself. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, but I think we're implicitly moving in that direction when we talk about conversations, or we talk about, we were likening it to a kind of, what was it? It was an internet chat or something like that. I mean, because really, what we're talking about is simply a diachronic conversation, right? When we're doing that, or if you're looking at kind of the Kongzi layer and then the Zisi layer, you know, and then somebody adding a quotation on at the end, because that's what you did in the Han, you know. So I don't feel it's necessarily, I mean, I do feel that it's not the way that I learned philosophy, but it strikes me that it's simply a, well, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, so I volley it back to you, but it seems to me that the dialogical aspect of it is still.
yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would dislike the result that would
Yeah.
say, yeah, I mean, even if you're going to read a paragraph as coherent, you're already adding, you know, you're not recapturing some original thing that was there. So then you do that on a chapter level, you can do that on a book level, whatever level you want. The connections are your reading of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I think that that's bad.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to think. That's why I asked it. I know it's a big topic. It's
Yeah,
across
and
a lot
I
of the
just have a
papers.
distrust of the principle of charity sometimes. I mean, it's not that I'm an uncharitable person, but I do feel like what that tends to do is really domesticate everything in terms of your own understanding. I mean, you can do a Geertzian kind of critique of common sense and on this and say, you know, really, then everything begins to sound like what makes sense to you.
I think it can go the opposite direction too, because if you think about Brooks' reading of that passage I was saying he's reading too much in, that's because of the principle of charity, right? He wants to read them all as a whole, and they're clearly not all a whole, right?
Right.
So then you have to really work to find something new. Whereas if you break it into pieces, you don't have to do that, because everyone can say something that's pretty much common sense.
Right.
If you break it into a small enough piece.
Right.
You know, so I do think it can go both directions.
Yeah, no, and I like that principle of charity much better, I'd have to say, or that application of it, if there is some kind of ideal principle of charity out there. Okay.
No one is. According to my body clock, it's like 5 a.m. So sorry if I don't make sense. But you can also, the principle of charity is a tricky one because it assumes that if there is any contradiction, then that's a weakness of the text and it's something to overcome, and hence the tendency to look at these oppositional passages as a problem to solve, as Brooks said. But without invoking principle of charity, which is problematic because it assumes that they were, working with a really narrow definition of coherence, which is argumentative coherence, we could maybe still just juxtapose passages with each other to make sense of them. And as Tobias put it, as kind of an interpretive experiment more than kind of assumption about the authors or intentions. So maybe there could also be kind of a middle way between just, I feel angry about that person who, I don't know who wrote on Dao about the principle of charity, and I really apologize as a philosopher that happened to you. and without, it's like a caricature of a philosopher, right? It's just seeking principle of charity and everything. But without even invoking that, maybe we can still, which is something that I do actually, and it's giving an context, broader context, in order to make sense of just this particular passage without necessarily talking about authorial intentions, but just as a way of playing with the text. And if I put this passage next to this one, maybe they kind of explain each other better or heighten certain themes within each story. So there might also be a middle way between the two.
Yeah. Well, and I thought that, and I understand kind of, I mean, I grew up I started all this reading Burton Watson translations of these, and so I understand the idea that, well, the unit of the book is sacrosanct, right? So we have to take these books as if they were, I understand where that impulse comes from, but I think just our discussion today of Zhang versus, sentence versus chapter is just so much more, that's what you have to ask. If you're going to use coherence as a criterion, you don't choose a unit and say, we're gonna use our principle of charity to make this into a coherent unit, right? You're gonna look at the different choices and say, well, this displays this type of coherence, but this displays this different standard type of coherence, and this might be created by an editor, and this might be created by an author. So I think that's already more sophisticated than the need to preserve the book unit. Now, if you're talking about the historical reception of it as a book, go crazy. Everyone during the song was saying, well, and the reason he put this chapter between this chapter and this chapter is, and then they come up with some kind of elaborate explanation. And that's what they did. And they saw it as a book, and more power to them. But if what we're doing is we're talking about the core text, then yeah, you have to, you can't do everything you want to. Well, for certain purposes, yeah, if you want to say, use it as constructive philosophy. But I find that some people kind of are playing a game where they're saying, well, this is historically important because it was Zhuangzi, and therefore we have to consider these ideas as constructive philosophy. And so then they force back their argument about the kind of, the utility of the philosophical argument back onto the historical, and use that as a kind of double claim, that historically then, by implication, that was what it meant, which is now again, well, and I have some examples of that, but I won't share them. You could probably guess.